On top we have 5 amber lights. 3 in the middle indicate commercial vehicle. 2 on the side indicate the height of the width of the cab. Make sure they're working properly, not cracked, not broken. Next, moving on to your air horn. Make sure it's working properly bolted to the cab. It's all bolts and nuts. From there, you're moving on to your weather stripping. Weather stripping not ripped or torn to prevent any water or air from entering the cab. From there, you're moving on to your front windshield. Make sure your front windshield's not cracked or broken. No illegal stickers. Kept clean at all times. From there, you're moving on to your mirror bracket. Mirror bracket is properly held in place. It's all bolts and nuts securely to the door. Your mirrors properly secured to the bracket. It's all bolts and nuts. From there, you're moving on to your wiper arms. Your wiper arms working properly, held in place with all bolts and nuts. Your wiper blades, make sure they're kept new at all times. If possible, make sure they're in good working condition. From there, you're moving on to your hood. Hood, easy open, easy up, easy down. From there, you move on to your grill. Make sure it's not cracked or broken, no missing pieces to prevent trash and debris from entering and causing backflow. From there, you move on to your 4 amber lights. 2 on this side, 2 on the other side. Those are your turning signals, forward flashers, and running lights. Make sure they're working properly. From there, you move on to your clear lights. Clear lights are your highs and your lows. Make sure they're working properly. From there, you're moving on to your bumper. Your bumper, make sure it's not cracked, not broken, no illegal welds. Make sure it's held in place with all bolts and nuts. Make sure your license plate is up to date, held in place with all bolts and nuts. Make sure it's kept clean. Also, under the vehicle, you're looking for 4 things. Make sure you don't see these 4 things. No spills of diesel, coolant, power steering, or oil. Make sure you see none of those. Also, make sure you don't see any hanging wires, no hanging belts or hoses. Also, you're looking at the front, make sure it's not leaning to the side. If it's leaning to the side, it could be 4 things. Uneven load, mismatched tires, bad air pressure, ripped or torn, airbag, broken or missing leaf springs. Make sure you see it's not leaning to the side. If it's leaning to the side, it could be one of those problems. From there, we're moving on to the side. Start on the exhaust. The exhaust, make sure it's straight up and down. Make sure it's not cracked or broken. If it's cracked or broken, it could cause poisonous fumes from entering the cab. Make sure it's held in place with all brackets and bolts. Make sure you see no cysts. Make sure your heat shield is held in place with all bolts and nuts. From there, we'll move on over here. We're going to start at the engine coolant reservoir. Make sure it's properly filled. Make sure it's capped at all times. Make sure it's not leaking. From there, you're moving on to your radiator. Your radiator, make sure it's properly filled. Make sure it's not cracked or broken, not leaking any water, as well as your hoses and clamps for your radiator. Make sure it's not ripped or torn, not leaking any water. From there, we're moving on to the alternator, which is belt driven. The belt driven, it's a belt driven component. The belt should not be no more than 3/4 inch play. Make sure it's in good working condition. From under here, you have your water pump. Your water pump, make sure it's working properly, not cracked, not broken, no illegal welds. Your water pump is gear driven. From there, we're moving on to your oil dipstick. Oil dipstick is always in place. You could use it to check your oil. From there, you move on to the turbo. Turbo working properly, not cracked, not broken, no illegal welds. From there, you move on to the intake. Intake working properly, not cracked or broken. Make sure all the clamps are working properly. From there, on the top of the engine, you have the oil filler cap. Make sure it's working properly. It's held in place, properly capped. Here we will start on the intake housing. Make sure it's properly held in place. All bolts and nuts properly secured to the cab of the vehicle. Your intake, make sure it's kept clean at all times. You could use this to make sure it's always in the green. If it's in the red, you got to change your air filter. From there, we're moving on to the washer fluid reservoir. Make sure it's properly capped. Make sure it's not cracked and broken. Not leaking any fluids. Here you have your power steering reservoir properly capped, properly filled. Make sure your power steering hoses are not leaking or the clamps are leaking either. If you follow the hose down, you will follow it to your power steering pump, which is gear driven as well. From there, we're moving on to the AC compressor. Make sure your AC compressor is working properly. It's properly secured to the engine with all bolts and nuts. Your AC compressor is belt driven, no more than 3/4 inch play. Also, your fan. Make sure your fan is not cracked, not broken, not missing any pieces, which is belt driven as well. It should not have no more than 3/4 inch play. Your fan should be at least 4 inches from your radiator as well. From there, we're moving on to the air compressor with governor, which is gear driven as well. Make sure it's working properly, not cracked, not broken, no legal welds. From there, we're moving on to the air lines. Air lines properly tucked away, not leaking, not cracked, not leaking any air. From there, moving on to the fuse box. Fuse box properly secured to the wheel well, properly capped, and the sticker on at all times. Make sure any electrical lines, no exposed wire to prevent any electrical fires. From there, we're moving on to the rubber boot. Rubber boot now ripped to torn to prevent any poisonous fumes from entering the cab. Next, you have your steering shaft. Steering shaft, not cracked, not broken, no legal weld. From there, you have your U-joints properly greased, properly working. From there, you got your steering gearbox. Steering gearbox held in place with all bolts and nuts, not cracked, not broken, no legal weld. Then you got your pitman arm, which is attached to your steering gearbox, held in place with all bolts and nuts. Here you got a cutter pin and castle nut on the front. On the back, you have a ball joint, which should be properly greased at all times. Then you got your drag link. Make sure it's not cracked, not broken, no legal weld. From there, we're moving on to your air line. Make sure not cracked, not broken, not leaking any air. Then you got your single outboard brake chamber. Make sure it's not leaking, no legal weld. Here you got your slack adjuster and push rod. Make sure you have no more than 1 inch play when brakes are released. Then you got your leaf springs. Your leaf springs, not cracked, not broken, not missing, no legal welds. Then you got your U-bolts properly held in place with all bolts and nuts. Then you got your shackles. Your shackles, not cracked, not broken, no legal welds. From there, we're moving on to your tie rod. Tie rod and tie rod arm. Make sure not cracked, not broken, no legal welds. Then you got your steering arm and steering knuckle here at the bottom. Make sure not cracked, not broken, no legal welds. Then you're moving on to your brake drum. Your brake drum, make sure you don't see any of the 4 things. Make sure you don't see any discoloration, no water, no grease, no oil. From there, we're moving on to the brake pads, no less than 1/4 of shoe life left in them. From there, we're moving on to the tires. ICD, inflation, condition, and depth. Inflation should be 90 to 100 psi, unless tire specifications say otherwise. Condition, not ripped or torn, no lumps, no bumps. And the depth, the front cannot have recap at all, and it has to be no less than 430 seconds. From there, you're moving on to the rim. Not cracked, not broken, no legal welds, not bended, preventing air loss. From there, you move it on to the valve stem. Never touching the rim. Not cracked, not broken, no legal welds. From there, we're moving on to the lug nuts with the spacer. Make sure they're properly fastened. If you see any rust, it's an indication of looseness. From there, we're moving on to the oil hub. Oil hub properly filled with your oil hub seal on at all times. From there, we're moving on to the doors. Easy open, easy close. Then you got your grab bar held in place with all bolts and nuts. Then you got your side step and your gas tank. Your gas tank is not cracked, not broken, no